The papers were signed at 10:17 on a bright Tuesday morning, and by 10:24, my wife was already discussing where I should leave the house keys. I remember that because I kept staring at the digital clock above the receptionist's desk, wondering how 11 years of marriage could end between 2 appointments and a tray of stale coffee. I picked up my suitcase, walked out without arguing, and decided I would never ask Mara for another thing. 7 minutes later, a black limousine stopped beside me. Welcome to Digital Story Corner. In today's video, we're telling the story of a man who walked out of his divorce with nothing but a broken suitcase, and the stranger's car that pulled up minutes later carrying more than he ever expected. My name is Everett Hail. At the time, I was 39 years old and worked as a facility supervisor at a private rehabilitation hospital outside Pasadena. It wasn't glamorous work. I knew which boiler made a knocking sound before rain, which elevator needed a firm push on the 3rd floor button, and which night nurse hid emergency chocolate in the linen room. I earned enough to pay bills if nothing expensive broke. Unfortunately, something expensive was always breaking. My wife, Mara, was different from me in almost every way. She liked schedules, clean countertops, expensive candles, knowing exactly what came next. She worked in corporate event planning and could organize a dinner for 400 people without forgetting a single place card. When we first met, I loved that certainty in her. She said she loved that I could fix anything with patience and a screwdriver. For a while, that was true. Then my father got sick. He lived alone in a small house near Bakersfield, the same house where I had grown up. After a mild stroke, he could still walk and make coffee, but he forgot things. Once he left a pan burning on the stove. Another time he drove 20 miles and couldn't remember why. I started visiting every weekend, throwing clothes into a duffel bag Friday after work, driving north through traffic, coming home exhausted every Sunday night. Mara tried to be understanding at first. She really did. She packed sandwiches for me. She ordered my father one of those pill organizers with alarms. But months became years, and our marriage began to feel like a waiting room. We stopped taking trips. We postponed replacing the leaking patio door. I missed her company dinner because my father fell in the bathroom. She spent our 10th anniversary alone because I was sitting in an emergency room under fluorescent lights, charging my phone from a loose wall socket. There was no affair, no secret betrayal, nothing dramatic enough to make one person clearly guilty. We simply became two tired people keeping separate lists of disappointments. The final break came over money. My father needed part-time home care, and I had been paying for more of it than Mara knew. I told myself I was protecting her from worry. That was a lie, though not a cruel one. I was ashamed. I had used part of our emergency savings, planning to replace it with overtime. Then the hospital cut overtime entirely. Mara found the bank statement on a Thursday night, standing at the kitchen island in her gray work dress, holding 3 pages of numbers. I had just come home carrying groceries, including the wrong kind of yogurt, because I was distracted. "You should have told me," she said. She was right. I apologized, then explained too much. She reminded me of every time I'd said things were under control. I reminded her of every time she'd treated my father like an inconvenience. That was unfair too. By midnight, the groceries were still sitting on the counter. 2 weeks later, she asked for a divorce. The process took months, the way ordinary endings require paperwork. There were forms, emails, insurance questions, and one absurd argument over a red coffee grinder neither of us actually wanted. Mara kept the house because her mother had helped with the original down payment. I kept my truck, my tools, and a debt that seemed to grow every time I looked at it. The morning we signed the final papers, Mara's attorney had arranged a conference room in a converted hotel near downtown Los Angeles, marble entrance, tall columns, valet parking, the kind of place where even the water came in glass bottles. Mara arrived with her older sister, Karen, and 2 people from her office, since she had a client meeting afterward. I came alone, which is probably why the scene outside looked harsher than it was. Mara stood on the steps in a white dress, surrounded by people in clean business clothes. I wore a black sweater and old trousers, my suitcase beside me because I'd spent the previous night in a cheap motel after giving Mara the last set of house keys. When the meeting ended, she followed me outside, looking tired but composed. She was always good at holding herself together when other people were watching. I could tell she expected me to say something. Maybe I should have thanked her for the good years. Maybe I should have apologized once more. But I had spent months explaining myself badly, so I took the handle of my suitcase and walked away. At the edge of the circular driveway, the wheel of my suitcase caught in a crack, and the bag tipped over. My shirt spilled halfway out because the zipper had been broken for 3 weeks and I'd tied it shut with a shoelace. That was the lowest point, strangely enough. Not the divorce papers, not losing the house. Standing beside a decorative fountain, stuffing 2 wrinkled work shirts back into a cheap suitcase while people walked around me. Then the limousine arrived. Long, black, polished enough to reflect the palm trees. It moved slowly through the driveway and stopped beside me. I assumed I was in the way. A driver in a dark suit stepped out and opened the rear door, looking directly at me. "Mr. Hale." I froze with one hand still on my suitcase. Behind me, the conversation on the steps stopped. I knew how ridiculous the moment looked. I also had no idea what was happening. A woman stepped from the limousine. Her name was Odette Voss. Most people in Southern California knew that name, since Voss Medical Systems supplied rehabilitation equipment to hospitals across the country. She was in her late 60s, short, silver-haired. Walking with a cane she seemed slightly annoyed to need. I had met her once before 8 months earlier during a winter storm at my hospital. A private donor tour had been scheduled that afternoon, but heavy rain flooded part of the lower parking area. I found an older woman sitting on a folding chair near the service corridor, her coat wet, her driver gone to move the car. I brought her a dry towel and made tea in the maintenance office using a dented electric kettle. We talked for a few minutes. I didn't know who she was. She noticed a broken transfer lift waiting for repair and asked about it. I complained that the manufacturer had discontinued one small plastic component, forcing the hospital to consider replacing a machine worth thousands of dollars, and mentioned I'd spent evenings sketching a safer replacement design. She asked to see it. I showed her a rough drawing covered in coffee stains. That was all. Weeks later, someone from Voss Medical called the hospital wanting permission to review my design. I assumed nothing would come of it. Then my father got worse, the divorce began, and I stopped checking my personal email regularly. Now Odette Voss was standing beside a limousine while my former wife watched from the steps. She looked at my broken luggage and said simply, "I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks." She explained that her engineering team had tested my modification. It reduced strain on a commonly failing part and could extend the life of older rehabilitation lifts. Not revolutionary, just useful. And useful mattered. Her company wanted to license the design and hire me as a field systems consultant, someone who understood what equipment looked like after years in real hospitals, not just on computer screens. I looked back once. Mara was still standing on the steps, her expression not jealousy. That would make the story simpler than life really is, but confused, then hurt. I understood why. For years, she had believed I was disappearing into problems that would never end. I had believed she'd stopped seeing value in me. Maybe we had both been partly wrong. I put my suitcase in the trunk and got into the limousine. The inside smelled faintly of leather and peppermint. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't open one of the sparkling water bottles in the door. Odette noticed but didn't comment. The job offer didn't solve my life overnight. I still owed money. My father still needed care. I still woke some mornings reaching toward the empty side of the bed. The licensing agreement took 4 months to finalize. My first weeks as a consultant were uncomfortable, since I owned one decent jacket and hated speaking in conference rooms. I called a senior executive by the wrong name during my second presentation. I left my laptop charger in Sacramento on my first field trip. Being noticed for good work creates new pressure, not instant peace. But the salary helped. More importantly, the schedule helped. Voss Medical allowed me to work remotely 2 days a week. I found a small apartment near my father's town and arranged reliable home care without hiding the cost from anyone. For the first time in years, I stopped pretending I could carry everything alone. 3 months after the limousine ride, Mara emailed me. The subject line said, "Coffee grinder." I laughed when I saw it. She'd found the red grinder in a moving box and wanted to know if I wanted it. We met at a quiet cafe on a Sunday afternoon. There was no reunion, no sudden speech about destiny. She'd cut her hair shorter. I'd lost weight. We looked familiar to each other and somehow older. She asked about my father. I asked about her work. Then she apologized for something I never expected, saying she'd spent years believing that if she organized life perfectly, nothing bad could reach us, and that my father's illness frightened her because it couldn't be scheduled or solved. I apologized too, admitting that helping people had become an excuse for shutting her out, that I'd made decisions alone and called it sacrifice. We sat there for almost 2 hours. When we left, she gave me the coffee grinder. That was it, and strangely, it was enough. A year later, my father died on a cool November morning with the radio playing softly beside his bed. His last months weren't easy, but they were peaceful. I was there more often. I learned to cook the terrible oatmeal he liked. I stopped correcting him when he confused Tuesday with Thursday. At his funeral, Mara came alone, standing near the back. Afterward, she handed me a small envelope containing an old photograph of my father fixing a bicycle in our garage, found in a drawer at the house. That simple act stayed with me longer than the limousine ever did. Today, I still work with rehabilitation systems. I'm not a billionaire. I never became famous. My design earned enough to clear my debts and build a modest savings account, but mostly it gave me work I was proud of. Odette once told me that companies often overlook people who understand problems because those people are too busy fixing them to prepare impressive presentations. I think about that often. I also think about Mara. We didn't remarry, but over time we became something gentler than strangers. We exchange birthday messages once a year. Every December we meet for coffee. The red grinder sits in my kitchen now, still making an awful noise every morning. Sometimes people ask me about the day the billionaire's limousine pulled up after my divorce. They expect a story about revenge, about Mara regretting everything, about me becoming rich enough to make everyone who doubted me feel small. But that isn't what happened. The limousine didn't prove I was better than my wife. It simply arrived at a moment when I had almost forgotten that one small piece of work, done carefully and without applause, could still matter to someone. I used to think kindness meant giving until you had nothing left. I was wrong about that. Sometimes kindness is telling the truth before silence becomes distance. Sometimes it's accepting help without feeling ashamed. Sometimes it's returning an old photograph to a man you no longer live with, simply because you know he'll need it. The quiet lesson I carried from that Tuesday morning was simple. Losing one future doesn't mean your life has ended. It may only mean you've reached the place where you finally learn to live without pretending, and to notice that even after goodbye, there can still be a road ahead. If this story moved you, subscribe to Digital Story Corner and hit the bell. A brand new story drops every single day.